Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single podcast and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite subscription service.
Greetings and thanks for joining us today on A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Jacqueline Whitt, Professor of Strategy and the War Room podcast editor here at the U.S. Army War College. So the U.S. Army War College is part of a pretty extensive network of schools and institutions charged with a mandate for professional military education, or PME. And PME is a pretty evergreen topic of discussion within the Department of Defense and in various national security forums, including on War Room. And these questions are about what should we teach, who should do the teaching, what should the student body look like, what's the appropriate balance between military topics and academic pursuits. And these are long and important and spirited conversations. And so today's podcast is going to add to that discussion. And I'm joined in the studio today by Colonel Celestino Perez, who is an Army strategist and a professor in the Department of National Security and Strategy. He also holds a PhD in political theory from Indiana University. So Tino, thanks for joining me today here on the War Room.
Thank you very much, Jackie.
All right, so I'm going to start with a question, and it has a little bit of an ulterior motive. So Tino, how long have you been in the Army?
Well, I've been in the Army since I was commissioned in 1992 from West Point.
All right. So in your Army career, how long have you spent in a schoolhouse, that is, either as a student or a teacher?
Wow, that's a good question. Without adding up the years, like on
Math
the
in public
spot,
is really
it's
terrible.
going to be, I spent several years teaching at Fort Leavenworth, and also a year as a student there. And then I taught at West Point for 3 years, which isn't necessarily PME. And then at the War College, I've been teaching here for about a year and a half, and I was a student here. I would say probably 7 or 8.
And you did a PhD in there.
Oh, that's right. 2 years of coursework and then several years trying to finish up a dissertation. So there's 7 or 8 years really wrapped up in education, and probably more.
And probably more.
Probably more. I'm underestimating that.
If we counted all of that. So in terms of an Army career, that seems like an unusually high amount of time spent in school or teaching. And so I assume that this has been partly by choice. Tell us a little bit about why you've spent so much of your Army career in educational environments.
I knew that when I was a sophomore at West Point, I was taking a course in political theory from a Captain or Major Dister a long time ago. And I knew from that moment on that I wanted to go and study politics in some capacity after graduating West Point. And so the opportunity arose to be able to teach at West Point, and I was able to see that there are real strong connections between what scholars are doing and what soldiers are required to do. Soldiers understood broadly to include all the services, what we're supposed to do on a battlefield. And these connections were not readily made either in the scholarly world or really even at West Point when I was teaching there. So making the connection between scholarship and the practice of the profession of arms has been critical.
Yeah, because sometimes I think we want to think of these as sort of separate realms or separate domains, that there are things that concern military professionals and there are things that concern academics, and finding that crossover is sometimes really difficult. So can you give us maybe a couple of examples of where you see that crossover happening?
The most startling example came when I returned from Iraq as part of the surge. So that was 2008, and it's been 50 months there. I was finishing up my dissertation from Indiana at the time, and my dissertation was on a normative topic. It was on the theme of religion and politics. So I was comparing an atheist, a non-believing thinker, Jürgen Habermas, a prominent public intellectual and philosopher from Germany, and Karol Wojtyła, or Pope John Paul II, who's obviously a religious believer. And I was comparing their works in several different ways. My exposure to international relations theory and comparative politics as it relates to civil wars, and interstate wars was pretty minimal in Indiana. When I returned, I stumbled upon this symposium that Perspectives on Politics held on FM 3-24, where it had several notable scholars commenting in friendly but critical ways about the underlying premises of the doctrinal manual, which was later published with the University of Chicago.
Well, they like hit print on it,
right? It's a success, so we'll take it up.
It's not copyrighted. So,
but one of the participants was Stathis Kalivas, who at the time was at Yale, and I would consider him the dean of Civil War scholarship. I think many of his students are all over the place doing granular work in Civil Wars. And the things that I started to look up in his corpus were things as far back as 2003. Remember, I deployed in 2007. 2003, the Ontology of War, or the Ontology of Political Violence, the article, that described exactly the kinds of challenges that my soldiers and I faced in Iraq. And these challenges were nowhere discussed in the train up to the war, and even in the intellectual preparation for the war at Fort Leavenworth, even in FM 3-24. And so I said, well, what more is here? And there's much scholarship on. And
you start sort of peeling back this onion, and you just keep going.
I went to JSTOR, and I think I filled up 2 binders worth of Civil War scholarship, because that was the thing that we were concerned about at the time. Afghanistan was.
We were finally calling that
right
a civil war, I think. So if we think about this relationship between theory and practice, between scholarship and practice, I know this is something that it's important, and it's personal for you too. So here at the Army War College, we talk a lot about strategy. We use the word strategy all the time. We both work in the Department of National Security and Strategy. We have the School of Strategic Land Power. Our course is called The Theory of War and Strategy. I joke that our students play strategic softball, right?
Of course.
So how does this, I guess, is mission too strong a word, but this purpose that you have to think about the relationship between scholarship and the profession of arms, how does that help us think about the question of strategy in particular?
I think the definition of strategy that we use here at the War College, which I think is the nuts and bolts of us are common across several different institutions, but it's this idea of thinking in terms of ends, ways, and means, accounting for risk. And really, this is something that we know as instrumental reason, trying to reason to achieve a certain aim, given what you have. I think all these definitions work, and I'm not really caught up on creating a new definition of what strategy is. I am interested in what strategy entails. But one weakness of the way that we view strategy here at the War College, I think also operational art and tactics at Fort Leavenworth, is we neglect the environment. So I argue that understanding the environment, there's a primacy to that. And before you understand or before you attempt to align ends, ways, and means, you have to devote a solid amount of energy to describing the environment in some way that's provisional, but that's a necessary work.
So if we describe the environment, and we, like you said, the ends, ways, means construct isn't useless, right? It has particular utility in how we think about and articulate what a strategy is and what a strategic actor is trying to accomplish. How does that inform your teaching here at the War College?
Well, let me describe a pathology that I see routinely. I saw it both at Leavenworth and I see it here. And my colleague, Dr. Megan Hennessy, and I are actually involved in a study where we're trying to justify this observation or prove it in some compelling way, or disprove it, as necessary. What we see when we give students an actual problem to deal with, say, how should we proceed in Syria? Or how should we proceed vis-a-vis Russia in Europe? The first thing that students do is they look at the highest level strategic guidance that exists. They'll look at the national security strategy, and then they'll work their way down. Very seldom, and I haven't seen it here at the War College at all, is there an attempt to actually go to the problem area geographically and try to decipher the various complexities, social, political, institutional, ethical, that are in play in a rigorous way. And the only way you do this is by consulting experts, whether those are practitioners, say a diplomat who's worked the area for a long time, whether it's scholars who have regional expertise or some sort of other expertise that can help them peel back what's going on there, and especially local stakeholders, people who are involved in the conflict. Our students aren't accustomed to doing that research, engaging in perspective taking to inform.
Why I have some hypotheses about why that might be, and I think my sense is that it has to do with the idea that political guidance at end states are set by actors external to the military, and so that someone else, a political master, civilian master, will give the military its sort of end states, and then for the Army especially, it becomes like a backward planning exercise, right? How do we get with end states defined or objectives defined? What do we have at our disposal? What levers do we have to pull in order to affect that? Does that comport with sort of your diagnosis?
Oh, absolutely. I think that especially at this level of education here at the War College, the presumption is that we can simply take the political aims that are given to us from on high, and then we fill out the rest of it, the military component of whatever comprehensive intervention the U.S. is.
As it were.
But there's always latitude into how we specify our military objectives and how we employ our various means to accomplish our aims. So you can imagine this easily by replacing one imaginary commander with another. And the next commander would have a totally different set of priorities and ways of thinking about the intervention, even within a comprehensive intervention where we're talking about diplomatic means and economic means and others.
Sure.
And so there's always latitude, and we're not thinking through exactly how much latitude is actually there.
So instead of that sort of tendency to start with ends and then work back, and to, like you said, to start with very high level ends from the national security strategy and then national defense strategy and sort of nested on down, where would you recommend that students and practitioners and strategists then start? I think the environment sounds like thing number one.
So right now, so my discipline is political science. That's my academic discipline, and
it's okay. We can be friends anyway.
We can still be friends, and we need to be because I think that the three departments here have people with expertise in various disciplines, and all of these relate, and perhaps more that aren't represented here relate to the practice of strategy and war. But I think that political science has more than simply the three IR theories that we talk about, constructivism and liberalism and realism. It actually has tools to help us think about causal claims. How is the world working? Or if we take this action, why might this cause or bring about or help bring about another outcome? It also, political science and it also helps us think through normative questions. What is the right thing to do here? Whether in terms of the smart thing to do, but also the ethical thing to do. And ethics at the U.S. Army War College is something we're really not peeling back here. There's very little voice for military ethics in our curriculum, apart from an hour or two of instruction. So my mantra is that strategy is performance, and we need to, as often as possible, put students in a situation in the face of an intractable problem and attempt to establish what the aim should be given the guidance, right? What interventions might work or might not work, or what can we try experimentally given the makeup of the environment. And that's
why those and why certain things might have certain effects, or why certain things might work in one context but not another. So really making explicit those causal stories, the levers that you're pulling, and what effect, because at some level you do need strategy to be instrumental, right? You're trying to make it do something, and you're trying to achieve effects, and if you don't know what effects those might achieve, then you might be in for long war, I suppose.
And we see that, right? We see that playing out today in several places.
Yeah, we'll just try something else. And so your argument is that scholarship from a variety of disciplines, but particularly from political science, can help strategists understand causal claims and causal mechanisms that might affect things in the real world.
Right. And can I give an example here,
Please.
So, Jackie, I ask you, and I'm hoping there's educators out there who are listening. When you ask your students to tackle a problem and you give them the space and time to do that, right? Invariably, what you're likely to see is an end state or a desired end, a desired aim that looks something like a stable and secure X. Whether we're talking about an interstate war with a near-peer competitor or a intervention in a civil war. A stable and secure country X or region X. And then you'll have these lines that are drawn pointing to this desired end or end state. The causal links of how these arrows work together and how these arrows actually effect change in the landscape or the obstacle course that we're negotiating is almost never specified. And these are the causal assumptions that we need to interrogate as military professionals and as national security professionals, and we're not doing it.
So how do we, as educators in a PME environment, how can we do this in classrooms with real students who come to us with a really huge variety of educational backgrounds, of operational experience, and even from different countries and different perspectives?
Right, and that's the trick, right? So do you need the same level of education for all of the students, or are some students going to be attuned to these issues more readily than others? I think that instruction in causal logics, in evaluating normative claims, is appropriate for all students, and it's the teachers and the institution's job to identify those who have a special talent for it and then put them in a situation where they're able to exert that. Because what we need for our senior military leaders, especially at the flag officer rank, are people who can engage in this sort of thinking. We don't want them thinking as tacticians when they're working as generals, even in a 3-star command, for instance.
Right. So we need to train military strategic thinkers who can participate in these broader national strategic conversations, who can have a seat at the table and who can hold their own and influence maybe the conversation as well. So if you were going to, and I know you talked about the sort of the pilot and the programs that you've been doing with Dr. Hennessy as well, what are some of the ways that you envision helping students practice this? Because one of the nice things about the schoolhouse is that we have 10 months. It's low risk in many ways, right? Yes. We're not practicing in the real world, even if we use real world scenarios. So what might practice in the schoolhouse look like for this?
So right now, the standard model or the standard experience for the student, 9/10 of the year, would be the Socratic dialogue, or really a facilitated dialogue led by the teacher, based on readings that the students did the night before, and they'll have a light 3-hour conversation about the various themes in the readings, and then they go home, they rinse and repeat, and they do it again. This doesn't really exercise critical thinking, right? This is let's have a conversation that could be entertaining, it could be shocking, it could be jarring, but not to the extent of actually engaging in problem solving where the students have to roll up their sleeves and over a sustained period of time tackle something. So what I would like to see is not eliminate the discussion from the classroom. That's necessary, and much of what we do still requires that sort of delivery.
So we're not talking about getting rid of reading, right?
No, of course not. Yeah, and we can address this critique of something I wrote in War on the Rocks as well. But we need to shift a lot of our time towards actual practice. And so you can go to Congressional Research Service, for instance, the CRS publications, the stuff that congresspersons and their staffers are reading about Yemen, about Syria, about Russia, about China. And you can start with that publication, and then branch out from there to try to get as many different complementary and especially competing perspectives on what's going on with these different problem sets. Have the students read different things and then bring them together. And using whiteboards, I'm a big fan of whiteboards. Whiteboards in the classroom attempt to graphically describe these competing and complementary perspectives in a way that we can then understand the environment, and based on that, recommend aims and specific interventions with what we have.
So these are problems that are then underpinned by the readings and the discussions of scholarly work, of regional experts, of local voices, rather than just sort of reading about a problem and then talking about it. What's been the most successful thing that you've seen in a classroom that sort of employs this approach? How would you know if it's working, I guess?
Wow. So the most successful employment of this approach was at Fort Leavenworth, where I was given the freedom by the leadership to start a scholars program there. There was one already there that was based on history, right? And then I introduced one based on political science, but really all the disciplines, or as many disciplines. And here I was able to handpick the students, which is a treat, right? Because you know that they want to be in the classroom and they want to have a certain experience. But I was able to give them, after their core instruction of 3 months, which they took with their homerooms, they came to me for the remaining time. And I gave them tools to break open the environment, right? Various tools. And then after about 2 months of that instruction, I unleashed them on two things, both their papers and then a series of exercises. And we met for the latter part of that only 2 times a week. Now, the students were in the library, and my colleagues would tell me, "Hey, I saw your students, in the cubicles up there in the library with the students from the School of Advanced Military Studies, yeah." And they were all there together every day, despite being in class twice a day. But what this meant is they had time for reflection. And then when they came to class, they were actually able to dig into a problem with depth and comprehensiveness in a way that they would be required to do once they graduated. And that was really successful. These students, one of them is showing up here in the next class for the Army War College, and they've had great success out there.
Good. So, Tino, we'll sort of wrap up this conversation, but I think this gets us to a lot of the current questions that are happening in PME, right? What's the right balance, like I said at the beginning, between theory and practice? What's the right balance? What do military professionals need to know? What do we mean by strategy and strategic thinking? And I think you've given us one way to envision teaching strategy that is underpinned clearly by research and scholarship, by curiosity, right, as a sort of driving feature of this, and at the same time giving students real world sort of practice and with knotty problems, right? Syria and Yemen and Russia and all of these are extraordinarily complex and are going to require good thinking going forward. So I'll let you have the last word if there's anything maybe you want to leave our listeners with today.
No, the final thing, I guess, and this is based on some critiques that I've heard of some of the essays that I put out there, but this distinction between training and education is something that is like an article of faith out there, like the nature, character of war, which we've talked about. But this distinction between training and education, I would like people to think about maybe softening it. This morning I was rewatching YouTube videos of a scholar on China, and she described her, quote, training and education in grad school for a PhD, and her training as a military reserve officer. And I know that when my colleagues at Indiana talked about their training in the political science conferences, scholars talk about their training.
Right. And disciplinary training.
Right.
You're trained to think in certain ways and to do certain things in order to achieve results.
And the same people who are fans of this distinction, like hard fans of this, or fans of this hard distinction, are also fans of, seems to be critical thinking skills. And skills are something that have to be trained, like any other performance that's worthwhile. So what are we trying to achieve in the classroom? We're not just trying to give the students a liberal arts education where they go out as good citizens, but we are here at a school for national security practitioners. That is, people who are going to practice in the national security realm. And the things that we give them have to be related in some way, whether indirectly or directly, to the performance of the alignment of ends, ways, and means, risk, given, and intractable.
So that PME isn't just a place where we talk about strategy or about national security or about leadership, but we give students the opportunity to practice them with expert facilitators, with support, with a library, right, down the stairs or down the hall, and all the things that they need to do so that when they go out into the real world, they can do it, right? So this is like layup drills.
Exactly, Jackie. Yes.
All right. So with that, we'll close out today. This is Jackie Witt for the War Room.
Thank you very much.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.